On 5 News, one for the record books, Team GB makes Olympic history. Our sportsmen and women increase the medal tally for the 5th consecutive Games, even beating our total from London. Rio has now passed the torch to Tokyo in a closing ceremony full of carnival spirit. Minds are already focused on 2020 and whether Team GB can continue its winning ways. Also tonight, plans to stop extremists such as Anjem Choudhury radicalising other prisoners. 1 year on from the Shoreham air disaster, victims, families and survivors gather at the crash site. The brave little boy whose mother is determined to stop others losing their limbs or their lives to toxic shock syndrome. And an Olympic hero's shame. US swimmer Ryan Lochte tells America and Brazil he's sorry. Welcome to 5 News. I'm Danny Sinha. In a blaze of colour, the Rio Olympics have been brought to a dazzling finale, but the awards are to keep on coming for Team GB. After their most successful overseas Olympics ever, finishing second above China, the Queen has, in the past few minutes, offered them her warmest congratulations, whilst the Prime Minister says there's no limit on the number of athletes who could be given an honour. Well, last night, the team, complete with flashing shoes, took part in a carnival-inspired closing ceremony, as Layla Hayes reports.
A spectacular end with a carnival theme. After 16 days hosting the Olympics, Rio closed the Games in style, with fireworks over the Maracanã Stadium. Team GB, complete with flashing footwear, joined in the party, and with much to celebrate. This Britain's most successful Games in more than a century. Super heavyweight boxer Joe Joyce was the final British medal winner. His silver, the 700th Team GB Olympic and Paralympic medal since lottery funding began. The Prime Minister says there'll be no cap on the number of honours available for Team GB athletes. So after Mo Farah's long-distance double-double, will it be a rise, Sir Mo?
I just want to continue doing what I do best, and that's to run. But at the same time, it'd be pretty incredible and amazing to be knighted. It's like I don't want to really think about it because it'll be amazing.
It's the 5th consecutive Olympics where Team GB has improved on its medal tally, finishing second in the medals table behind the USA and ahead of China, with a total of 67 medals, including 27 gold. That was way above their target of 48 medals and 2 more than in 2012, and with a team which was a third smaller than in London. So how did they do it? Experts say it's largely down to funding. UK Sport spent £274.5 million of national lottery money funding sports for the Rio Games. That works out as £4 million per medal. But not all sports are funded equally. Basketball is hugely popular with British teenagers, but has had its funding cut, because unlike sports like rowing and cycling, it's not expected to win medals. The coach at this London club says that's not fair.
These Olympians who do work extremely hard, when they come on television, they thank the lottery people who are funding them. They probably never bought a ticket. They probably wouldn't know what to do if they bought a ticket. The lottery is funded by in areas like this, and yet, ironically, they don't see any of the benefits of this, and that's a shame.
But the chair of UK Sport told me Britain's success in Rio shows the funding strategy works.
Well, I feel that that's our job. Our job is quite specific by our terms of reference, which were given to us by government at the end of the 90s, was to win medals at Olympic and Paralympic level, and we've done that.
Rio now hands over to Tokyo. Super Mario revealed as the Japanese Prime Minister. In the coming years, there will be questions of legacy and how best to improve sports at grassroots level. But for many, Team GB's success in Rio is proof of money well spent. Layla Hayes, 5 News.
Convicted Islamic extremists to be kept in separate units in jail to try to stop them from radicalising other inmates. It's one of a series of new measures being introduced by the government in England and Wales. And it comes just days after it emerged one of Britain's most notorious clerics was convicted of persuading people to join so-called Islamic State. Julian Drucker reports.
He's awaiting a jail sentence after radicalising hundreds with his hate-filled ideology. But there are fears that for Anjam Chowdhury and others like him, the inside of a prison is no barrier to their powers of influence. Removing the most dangerous of them from the general prison population is one of several solutions being recommended by the government.
This is an absolute priority. We need to tackle this issue. It's a growing threat in our country, and we cannot have safe prisons. We cannot have prisons which are reforming inmates when we have these serious problems with extremism.
The measures include creating special units in high security jails. These so-called prisons within prisons will isolate extremists from other inmates. Books regarded as extremist will be banned from prison libraries. And inmates who behave in a way deemed to be subversive will be banned from taking part in Friday prayers. But some suggest the housing of extremists together is not the best way of curbing radicalisation.
Why are we taking a situation where we're effectively incubating a whole group of prisoners who share the same ideological outlook, rather than actually just dispersing them? Because we're looking at very, very small figures here. We're looking at very small numbers, and therefore it would be easier to just merely disperse them across high security prisons and keep them in isolation for large periods of time and monitor any interaction they have.
It's an old idea adapted for a new era. During Northern Ireland's Troubles, Republican and Loyalist prisoners were segregated in the Maze prison. But packed together, they ended up in effective control of their cell blocks. It is, however, a change in approach, which some fear could concentrate the problem rather than extinguish it completely.
Julian, just how realistic is this plan? We know lots of prisons struggling to make space already for inmates.
Danny, they do this in the Netherlands, in France and in Spain, separating out those terrorist prisoners into separate units. Now, there are 8 high-security prisons in England and Wales. Even if only half of those prisons get these new units, that will be expensive. Extra staffing means extra cost. It's a huge policy change, though. Since the 1960s in England and Wales, our most dangerous prisoners have been dispersed around the system. The critics have always said, though, that this plan might result in British versions of Alcatraz, the notorious American jail, and that becomes a badge of honour for our most dangerous prisoners to aspire to get into.
Julian, thank you. Police have seized 2 drones carrying drugs and mobile phones as they were flying towards a jail in North London. Officers intercepted the devices whilst investigating attempts to smuggle contraband into Pentonville prison. No arrests have so far been made. Former Radio 1 DJ Chris Denning has pleaded guilty to 21 historical child sex offences. The convicted paedophile admitted to abusing 11 children at a disco in Surrey between the late 1960s and mid-1980s. He's already serving 13 years in jail for other child sex offences. And ballot papers for the Labour leadership election are being sent out to around 650,000 eligible members. The winner of the contest between Jeremy Corbyn and Owen Smith will be announced in a month's time. It's reported many of the 50 people killed when a suicide bomber targeted a wedding celebration in Turkey were children. One official says at least 20 of the victims were aged between 12 and 14 years old. The bomber is said to be of a similar age. The attack in the city of Gaziantep has been blamed on so-called Islamic State, as Charlotte Grant reports.
It's becoming all too familiar here in Turkey, as the latest victim of a bomb that killed more than 50 people is buried, yet another family grieves. The bombing was the deadliest attack so far this year, but not the first. There have been a series of suicide blasts in Turkey. The country's president believes one group is to blame. President Erdogan said the latest attack was by so-called Islamic State and revealed that the killer, who wore an explosive belt, was as young as 12 years old. Just as the suicide bomber was young, so were many of the victims. The explosion went off at a wedding as the celebrations were coming to an end as people were dancing in the streets. Now in Gaziantep, they're clearing up after yet another attack. But many are troubled that this time the person responsible for planting the device was only a child. And yet, 500 miles away in northern Iraq, another child is arrested by police. Around his waist is a suicide belt, which officers later said contained 2 kilograms of explosives. This boy is only 11, but for children's charities that work in the region, the number of child suicide bombers working for IS could only increase.
Any group that finds itself squeezed on the battlefield will generally resort to wider terror tactics. So these dreadful 2 stories of the last couple of days of young children being used as suicide bombers, is quite possible that that will become more frequent in Iraq, in Syria and surrounding countries.
In Turkey, while the government vows to cleanse Islamic State from its borders, its victims are left wondering when the next attack will happen. Charlotte Grant, 5 News.
Still to come on the programme. You'll want to hear this mum's advice after her son's near brush with death.
You go from what a burn is horrendous to suddenly your son's fighting for his life. It was, never in a million years I thought that would happen.
And the US swimmer in hot water over this infamous night out says sorry. All that and much more after the break. Welcome back. You're watching 5 News. As we've said, the Olympics is at an end and most athletes are enjoying a well-earned rest. But one American swimmer is dealing with the fallout from his actions in Rio. Ryan Lochte has been dropped by a sponsor after claiming that he and 3 teammates have been robbed at gunpoint. In fact, they've been stopped by security guards for vandalism. Well, he's told American networks he wasn't lying, just exaggerating the story. Minnie Stevenson reports.
Ryan Lochte was living the American dream. With 12 Olympic medals to his name, he is one of the most decorated in history. But the US star's fall from grace is continuing to make the front pages. Branded a liar, today Lochte took to American TV to say sorry for exaggerating claims that he and his teammates were robbed at gunpoint while at the Rio Olympics. When the truth was, as the CCTV footage shows, the staff in red only approached the men after they had drunkenly vandalised a petrol station.
That's why I'm taking full responsibility for it, is because I over-exaggerated that story. And if I never done that, we wouldn't be in this mess.
Lochte then directly apologised to the people of Brazil for overshadowing the Olympics.
My deepest apologies. They put on a great games. They did everything. The people of Rio or Brazil, the authorities, everyone there, they put on a great games. And my immature, intoxicated behavior tarnished that a little.
Close to tears, Lochte also said sorry to his teammates for what he called over-exaggeration.
I let my team down. And, you know, I wanted to be there. Like, I don't want them to think that I left and left them dry, because, I mean, they were my teammates. I wanted to definitely be there.
Today, after saying they could not condone his behaviour, Speedo said they would be ending their sponsorship of Lochte. As the US Olympic Committee say the 6 times gold medalist now faces further disciplinary action after the golden boy of swimming cast a shadow not only over the sport, but the entire Games. Minnie Stevenson, 5 News.
A mother is calling for better awareness of a condition called toxic shock syndrome after her 3-year-old boy had to have both legs and several fingers amputated. Doctors treating Reuben Harvey-Smith failed to spot the potentially fatal illness, despite his mum's growing concerns. She says at one point she feared he was going to die. Olivia Kinsley has been to meet them both.
At the seaside, squealing with delight, you'd never know how much Reuben Harvey-Smith has been through. Just last year, both his legs and 7 fingers were amputated when doctors failed to spot an infection which nearly killed him. After being treated for an accidental burn, Reuben, then 2 years old, seemed unwell, so Mum Lou took him to Ipswich Hospital.
He was really lethargic, he'd got a rash on his inner thigh, Went up to the hospital, he vomited all on the way up to the hospital. The doctor came, I relayed obviously what had happened, the symptoms he was displaying, and he went, no, it's a severe sore throat, maybe tonsillitis, it's not the burn.
In fact, it was toxic shock syndrome and potentially fatal. When Lou rushed Ruben back to A&E, he was critically ill.
I was told to prepare myself for the worst, that the most we could hope for, that he'd make it through the night.
That must have been just awful.
Yeah, you go from what a burn is horrendous to suddenly your son's fighting for his life. It was, yeah.
Ruben had developed sepsis, which occurs when bacteria get into the body, often from a wound or infection. It can lead to life-threatening septic or toxic shock, so Lou wants everyone to know the symptoms. They include a high or low temperature, a fast heartbeat or fast breathing. There could also be dizziness, muscle pain, vomiting and diarrhoea. If you suspect sepsis, you should see a doctor straight away. William Mead died from sepsis. His parents are campaigning for better awareness. And so is Lou. She wants parents to know the signs and doctors to listen. Ipswich Hospital has admitted liability in Ruben's case, but Lou's not angry. She's trying to stay positive.
That positivity, I think, is what will make him going forward. It's about looking at what you could have had and where we are. We've got a lot to be grateful for.
Where are we going?
Not least the extraordinary way he's coping with the way his life has changed. Olivia Kinsley, 5 News.
A former Islamist militant has said sorry after pleading guilty to destroying holy monuments in Timbuktu. Ahmed Al-Faqih Al-Mahdi faces up to 30 years in jail for wrecking several 14th century buildings in Mali. He told the court in the Netherlands that he'd been swept up in what he called an evil wave by terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda. The leaders of Germany, Italy and France are meeting to discuss the future of the European Union after Britain's vote to leave. Angela Merkel, Matteo Renzi and François Hollande will discuss plans for Brexit, with EU countries divided over the speed and terms of Britain's departure. And officials investigating the death of singer Prince have revealed that pills found in his home had been mislabelled. The 57-year-old died in June from an accidental overdose. It's reported the drugs he'd taken were dangerously powerful, but the bottles they come from were labelled as a much weaker type. Family and friends of those who died in the Shoreham air disaster have held a minute's silence exactly 1 year on from the tragedy. Hundreds of people gathered for the commemorations to remember the 11 victims killed when a vintage jet crashed during an air show. Simon Weigelt was also there.
1 year on from the tragedy which devastated their lives, the people of Shoreham gathered on the bridge which became the focus for tributes. It is a few hundred yards from the crash site. 11 people died, including Worthing United footballer Jacob Schilt, who was travelling to a game. His parents told me today is an unavoidable milestone.
It's no more difficult actually than any other day, really, because there are so many things that to remind us of Jacob. So we're thinking about him the whole time, really.
Today's a day where you sort of put on a brave face and you know what you're dealing with in a way, whereas on the day-to-day it could be just looking at a photograph of him or looking at his football boots still in our utility room, and that can just set you off and make you really realise how dreadful it all is.
The vintage Hawker Hunter jet crashed during the Shoreham Air Show a year ago. The pilot miraculously survived. 52-year-old Andy Hill was questioned by police in December, but they're still waiting to receive evidence from the Air Accident Investigation Branch, which publishes its report in the autumn. It means the inquests won't happen until next year.
It's painstaking. Everything has to be looked at, and we understand that that takes time. It's better to have due diligence on that. But of course there are people who are grieving and need those answers, so there's always got to be a balance.
Jacob Schilt.
There is frustration here, but also an acceptance that nothing can be worse than what happened to them exactly 1 year ago.
I don't think there'll ever be closure. I don't see how there could be. He's with us. He was everything to us.
And it was so sudden. I don't think we could ever come to terms with it, and such unusual circumstances, and such a public thing as well. I don't think we will come to terms with it. We've just got to find a way of managing it, really.
Shattered families with shattered lives, but they know the communal support of the past year will endure. Simon Viger, 5 News, Shoreham.
Remembering the victims of the Shoreham air crash 1 year on. Now, just before we go, a quick look at what's coming up on 5 News tonight. And of course, we'll have a lot more on the fallout of Team GB's historic success. So just how much impact will those amazing performances, the ones that we saw from the likes of Mo Farah, have on the rest of the country? And of course, after that initial feel-good factor, will there indeed be a lasting legacy? We're going to be talking to 2 former Olympians. That's all coming up at 6:30. That's all from us. Sean Welby has got the weather next. I'll see you in an hour's time. Bye-bye.